Hey everyone, welcome to yet another episode of our taboo busting alphabetical journey. Today is K for knowledge. Now, knowledge is a really interesting topic to dive into because there's so many different elements of it that we wanted to talk about, but we really want to dive into the misconceptions of what knowledge really is, what the value of it is, and a certain elitism that can come when we conflate knowledge and intelligence with each other, and especially when we look at the difference between experience
Mhm,
and book learning.
mhm.
But before we dive into any of that, Sylvia, welcome once again to the show.
Good to see you, my friend. And I'm so excited to dive into this because I am going through a little bit of a pivot myself in my pursuit of something that's new to me, where there is this elitist viewpoint, or at least some very limiting beliefs. Speaking of letters for L, around what it means to have knowledge or have knowledge that would define expertise. So I'm super excited to dive into this topic with you today.
Absolutely, and I think if we start around that topic, I think it's really important to remember that even though I will never knock traditional education, and even though I myself, similar to you, have most of the knowledge that I currently use in my profession is not something I studied um, sort of in a university or college structure. Um, I don't want to knock that, but at the same
Mhm.
time, I feel like there's a lot of, as you said, to speak of next week, limiting beliefs around it, where a lot of us that have that background feel like we have more to prove.
Mhm.
And it's interesting how there's this fear of either where not just not knowing something, but almost having to prove where you know it from. And I know that we spoke just before we started recording about sometimes feeling like one of those college students that's been told they can't use Wikipedia as a source, so they scroll down to the citations and go, I'll just say that I got it from this book instead. Like it's it's this thing where we're almost afraid to say I know it from experience, possibly because at some point people have told you, oh, that's not enough, or that's not valid.
Mhm.
But I think from my perspective at least, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, I think um, that the book learning stuff is good, but without experience
Mhm.
it can be a bit hollow.
Mhm.
But experience without the book learning side of things can actually be quite powerful. But when combined, obviously they can form a bit of I guess a perfect storm of both sides, where you know something works because you've tried it, but you also understand why it works because you know the theory behind it.
I think you bring up a really interesting point about this perfect storm, and maybe even, peeling a layer back of the onion. I think right now what's happening in the world, especially in America, is a lot of people claim to have knowledge, right? It's
Hmm.
easy to claim they know something because they read a sentence somewhere. And I think, as I look at the current environment and all these debates about what is scientific, what is valid knowledge, what is valid insight, I think I'm a little bit at a loss myself too, because personally, right, I know that my experience in learning about leadership, thinking about leadership, has been something ongoing nearly all my life. Yet, for I can see why some people might go, well, you haven't had a formal training program attached to that, and it's almost the same tenor that I likely might use on somebody who claims they understand how viruses work,
Hmm.
while they go out and not wear a face mask and literally spray on people, right? So, like, I'm very fascinated by this topic, and I'm not sure that we can get to all of it today. Yet I'd be remiss not to mention this very sort of um, unique dynamic, right? There are some people who, based on very little experience and just maybe one or two sources that happen to pop up on their Facebook feed, they from there claim knowledge. Yet how do we discern that from what you and I just talked about in terms of, right, those years of experience? And even in years of experience, there's still the possibility that, like you said, someone might have the years of being in it yet never glean anything truly knowledgeable, right, or not knowledge based or insightful or reflective. So what are your thoughts about all that?
Well, I think if I step into the dangerous zone of talking about the virus, conspiracy theorists, and everything, I think there we run the risk of conflating again, no knowledge and opinion.
Mm,
And I think, not that I want to put down anything that either of us do, but I think there's also a big difference in what you learn in order to teach someone about sales or leadership versus what goes into teaching someone and telling someone and researching something
mm,
around contagious diseases,
hmm.
viruses, medicine.
Right.
There's a reason why med school is long as hell. There's a lot to learn. And my problem with this, and I saw this really good quote, I think sort of at the start of the pandemic, where someone said, you can always tell who's just talking out their ass and who's an
Mm.
expert by the fact that the one talking out their ass will say they know it. And
Yep.
it was this
Mm,
thing where if you see what a specialist says, they'll say something like, based on what we know so far, or based on this research, or according to the data from this. Whereas others will say, this dude in a pickup truck on YouTube said that masks are a lie and that the
mm,
government is against us and this and this and this, and therefore this.
hmm,
And they'll state it as a fact. And even if they give a source, like you said, it'll be something kind of dubious.
hmm.
And just to go on a slight side rant, and I promise I'll get back into it, but this kind of connects into knowledge, which is the scary thing about conspiracy theories to me is that they play into a lack of knowledge. They entirely count on the idea that you've got a scenario where there's a bit of it missing, and that bit is what they try to fill with whatever the hell they please.
Mm.
And they find people who will buy into that they will buy into pretty much anything to fill that gap because they cannot handle that gap being unknown. Where a scientist will see that gap and get excited and they'll go, I want to research what that gap is. Some people just want that instant gratification. So it's kind of like when people say, oh, the moon landing, yeah, that's fake. Do you know why? Read this essay about how Stanley Kubrick, he came clean about it by making The Shining, and people are like, yeah, that checks out, because they want an easy answer. Because as difficult as it is to take on, conspiracy theories are kind of moot when all the terrible stuff that's happening in the world is happening right in front of our eyes. If you just read the news and read, um, if you're saying, oh, but the news could lie to us, read news from several different countries. And if you see all of them saying like human rights violations and all this stuff, you'll see that no one needs to hide behind conspiracies when villains can just control stuff anyway.
Well, this brings up a really good point about that gap, right? That cognitive void that all of us are wanting to fill. And you're right, it is human nature to want to fill it with something because uncertainty, open cognitive loops are not comfortable for us. Yet
Yeah.
I like that juxtaposition that you offer between the people who look at that open space and go, what could be there, right? What are the possibilities, right? What can evidence direct our thinking towards, and then use evidence to conjure that conjecture, right? Versus people who just go like, I need the next best sounding thing to just fill it and I can move on with my life. And I think about how that plays into that state of fear that we talked about when someone doesn't know something. And and that's something I personally had struggled with earlier in my career, because I did grow up in an environment where I had a parent who wanted to close that loop as fast as possible, right? Saying something like, I don't know, was just inconceivable. Like there were all these limiting beliefs and internal narratives about what that meant for this person, my mother in this case. And so for me, like there was always this fear of not knowing and showing that I didn't know. Yet, you know, what I learned was I would rather be curious
Yeah.
than like that is actually one of my own values, my own virtues, in that like I rather go see what else is there. Let's see all the evidence, let's see all the dots that could be connected versus just connecting to the next dot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I absolutely agree with you. I'd say, when I'm asked what I see as key elements to my success in life, I always rank curiosity as one of the
Hmm.
top ones because I get excited when I don't know something. If I find a topic that I find that curiosity, when I
Yeah.
feel that, I dive in and I read more and more and more.
Yes.
And I genuinely think this, to tie it back into that knowledge topic, I think this is where our, I guess, misconceptions about where the value lies in knowledge. It's not about necessarily having that massive database in your head of knowing everything. It's knowing how to accrue that knowledge,
Hmm.
how to discern fact from fiction, how to utilize this tool that is the internet to not just find information, but question it, be skeptical, figure it out. And I think I remember when my brother went to college, he chose a college that did things a little bit differently. You could go into exams with literally anything you wanted. Did you have last year's exam? Go for it, bring it. Do you have your laptop? Bring it. Bring books, bring whatever. Because they said it wasn't about knowing everything, it was about knowing where to find the information. Because you could have all that stuff, but gain nothing from it if you didn't know how to use it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And unfortunately, that school changed their ways, but I remember hearing that and going, yeah, that's the learning of the future because, you know, I I don't need to know every single formula there is for every single math formula to be a salesperson, but knowing how to put them in an Excel sheet is pretty damn helpful.
Hmm.
And the same goes for anything else. You want to have a certain base, but knowing where to find it will also cost you through repetition to slowly get it stuck in your head. But if you don't know how to, again, discern fact from fiction, it's a dangerous thing. And you see it all the time with, especially, and this one's quite sort of close to my heart. I've seen people that have struggles with mental health that buy into a lot of fake knowledge and they jump on it, and that's why I guess I feel so strongly about the conspiracy theory idea of filling that gap of sort of paranoia with further paranoia,
Hmm.
because it can have really dangerous effects on people, and we've seen that in recent years with um, I don't want to use the word fake news, so I'll use something else, but just false propaganda being used to incite violence and hate between groups. And it's scary because if we just thought about the power that knowledge can truly bring us and how education and true education and helping us and enabling us and empowering us to educate ourselves,
Hmm.
we can bring our whole quality of life to a different level.
I had an insight a second ago as you were thinking through this with this particular area of knowledge with me. I realized that those people. So again, going back to my own childhood, right? My mother never would admit she didn't know something, and she would claim to know something in even though clearly she didn't know it, and it was a short-term solution to a problem that likely would not even happen and certainly didn't exist, which was
Mm,
that if she claimed she knew something, she was presumably less likely to be taken advantage of. So there was this
mm,
idea that, hey, like I'm gonna fake it till I make it, right? Like I'm just gonna come out of the game and be like, oh, I know, I totally know what this is, so that the other person would, find no opportunity to attack or to, uh, right, take advantage, I guess, of the lack of knowledge. Yet what would happen in her case was, she just faked it. There was no making it because it would literally stop there. The buck would stop there, right? She would be like, oh, I know. And then there would be no further research, no further curiosity. And what would happen then naturally was the next time this thing surfaced, she was no better than the last time, right? So she still lacked the knowledge, had to fake it again. Except now it's like, well, the chances of her being taken advantage of without her closing that knowledge gap, that those chances and that probability just went up again, right? So it's sort of like exactly what you said, that short-term gain might feel
Mhm.
really powerful, like it felt like probably a power move to her, yet it was a detriment, or a detriment in the making.
And it's funny because I think it is quite tied to a feeling of elitism, or even, the flip side thereof, feeling like you're left behind if you don't know something.
Mhm.
And there's this kind of ongoing, I guess, sort of joke within groups of people really into like obscure films or obscure music, where it was like you always hear someone say like, "Oh, have you heard this? This musician? Oh, I've heard of them. I haven't heard them." Like, "Oh, have you seen this film? Oh, I haven't seen it, but I've heard of it." And it's always as if then you don't lose all your credibility. You get to be part of the group, and
What
like
does that even matter? What does that credibility even matter, with or without it? You know what I mean? It doesn't
exactly,
matter.
but I've seen it so much in those circles, and it was so funny to me when I started seeing that in business too. It would be like you'd ask someone, "Oh, what sales methodology do you use?" And if they stutter a bit or a bit unsure, and you go, Sandler, Spin, yeah, I've heard of those. Yeah, I've used a bit of that. And you're just like, dude, I'm fine if you've just winged it up until this point. I just need to know if we're gonna
Right.
work together.
Right. Right. Like, do you know that there are sales
Yeah.
methodologies? Let's go back. But you're right. Like, without that baseline, how could you help them, right? Like, you are there to be in service, yet if they aren't even honest about their starting point, it's going to not be in service of them. Or
Yeah.
you can still be in service of them, but it wouldn't be as powerful without that
Well,
honesty and transparency.
because you need that foundation. And just to, it connects really nicely into a bit of a wrap up and an introduction to next week's theme. Because really, I think so often we do pretend to know something because we're filled with limiting beliefs. So, spoiler alert, next week is L for limiting beliefs. But it's really interesting to see how we put this almost unfair balance between the value of real knowledge and perceived knowledge. We want to be perceived as knowledgeable, smart, in with it, knowing everything. But at the same time, in your example of your mom, in between being asked about something, she didn't actually go out of her way to research it and be ready to face further questioning. And I think it also shows how, from both sides, we might ask a question, but if we don't have a follow up, it's pretty surface level, and
Right.
it doesn't really help us get over those limiting beliefs because that can be painful. But I guess we'll dive into that in more detail next week when we peel off further layers of this onion, like you said, or peel off layers of the ogre that is limiting belief.
Looking forward to it, my friend.
Absolutely.